All right, welcome everyone to another edition of the Subseasonal Forecast Contest discussion. Today's forecast is for March 3rd, and we're forecasting out through March 18th, March 22nd. That's the 16 to 20-day period, the subseasonal period. Let's see, in terms of the agenda today, I guess propose a sort of a similar format. We'll start with attribution. We were just talking about this, look back through the past week of verification in the season in general, and then we'll shift to the forecast period. And fortunate again to have an industry guest online. Dave D'Arcangelo has joined us, and it looks like Dave's also even participated, submitted a forecast, which is awesome. So Dave, we'll definitely give you some time here today. And also, I think Michael has some research. He's been working on bias, looking at the biases in the models, the ECMWF. And if we have a few minutes there, we'll definitely give Michael some time to talk about his research. And we'd love to get your feedback on that, Dave. So that'd be really helpful.
Sounds good.
Okay. Any other agenda items that you guys want to make sure we cover in today's call before we get going? Okay. Then let's start with attribution, right? So yeah, the most recent verification period is should be shown on your screen. That's from the forecast from Feb 11th, the 16 to 20-day forecast from Feb 11th, verifying, just the past few days. And it was a, I guess, let me sort by CRPS. That's our skill score here. And it was a tough one. Positive scores are good and negative scores are bad relative to the 30-year normal. And it was a confluence of things here. I think the verification was very close to the 30-year normal. So the 30-year normal was a very precise forecast. You can see the 30-year normal is 124.9 for the period, and verification was slightly above that. And at this point, there were a number of forecasts that were below that. Myself, here is a good example. When I was at 110, so I did not fare well, and the standard deviation was 23, so I did not fare well as compared to the 30-year normal, and there were some forecasts that even struggled a little bit more than that down there. I think we were coming out of a period, and I'll just pull up the Dynacast 2 here. I think, again, thanks to our friends at Maxar, we have access to some of this. You can see the verification. Here's the pattern here with a decent amount of cool, a slice of cool anyway, across Ohio Valley into the southeast, and that's what got us back to normal. And thinking back to this period, obviously we had come through some weeks of general warmth, and I think there was still that view of for a lot of us that we were going to kind of remain in that warm period here. So it was challenging, obviously. Just take a quick look at the upper level pattern here. Let's change this to 500 millibar. And again, for folks who haven't used this, I definitely encourage, especially students who haven't used this tool. Not only is it helpful, but it's a lot of fun too. And in some ways here, as I think about the attribution for this, and please, folks can jump in here, especially here in just a minute. I'll shut up. But in some ways, this was this is in part, I think, what makes subseasonal forecasting difficult, trying to capture maybe subseasonal or synoptic scale kind of variability, because in a sense here, you didn't see a major. You can make a case here that you didn't see a major pattern configuration change. You still see, I'm thinking back to what Michael's talked about this winter, a lot of positive AO-ish, right? And I'm not looking at the index. I'm just looking at this, big ball of red and purples or whites up near the pole. So it's not like we saw a complete change in the AO. It's not even that we saw, a massive ridge over Alaska. It was a little bit of ridging trying to sneak into the Gulf of Alaska, but it's a very mixed pattern there in terms of the EPO. But we did at least briefly get this trough into the eastern states. And just one other thing tied to that is we look at. And this is sort of my point about synoptic scale. As we, I'll just pull up here. I know some folks still get used to this, but this is looking at the HDDs in a tabular format. This is from the EC ensemble is here where my cursor is pointing, and it's color coded by above or below normal. So where you see lots of the yellows and reds, it suggests that it's warmer than normal. And you can see the dates here on the left, and the actual maximum forecast is all the way here on the left. The EC is over here. So I'm looking at the 0Z EC because that's last complete run. And what you see here is generally still kind of a warmish pattern, right? It's still generally below the 30-year for this period, and you can actually look at the next 5 days exactly, 100 HDDs versus the 30-year normal of 117. So, you know, unless there's a dramatic change here, the next 5 days, my point is going to be, you know, warmer than normal, and the 6 to 10 also looks to be warmer than normal. So, you know, I think this is always one of those, and maybe I'll leave it here saying that in some respects, I think folks can look at maybe, you know, some of these forecasts here and say, oh, you know, Paul Around these forecasts, what was he thinking, whatever. On the other hand, this could be, I think you could make an argument too, that, you know, especially in the subseasonal where it's very difficult to pick out synoptic scale variability. You know, if in general you think it's going to be a warm forecast or warm period, I should say, let's say you think we're going into a 2 or 3 week period of warmth or a 2 week, 3 week period of cold, maybe it's the right play to, you know, to just kind of put out that significantly warm forecast, knowing that, you know, 1 out of the 3 times, or, you know, 1 out of the 4 times, you're gonna have a significant hit, but those 2 or 3 other times are going to be really sharp forecasts where you're going to hit in terms of the intensity of the warmth. So anyway, I'll stop there. Other folks here, please jump in. Other thoughts on the recent pattern?
Hey, Dave, this is David Arcangelo, and your points are well taken, and talking about the volatility of kind of hitting a small window in an overall pattern, and this was another unique one, you know, from perhaps a different perspective from last week. Even though it's been an overall extremely mild pattern, this is a specific window that did not. And if you would move it, if you would shift it by just 36 hours, for instance, forward, and looked at verification probably from Feb, whatever, close to like the 28th to the 3rd, which would be ending today, you know, it's likely that it would be a really strong verification. So I never like to say like right answer, wrong reasoning, because, you know, who knows about the kind of the synoptic variability, but you know, these hitting like that target of a specific 5-day window is, you know, I think this is a good example of how difficult that is, because it's been relatively easy. Yeah, there you go. That, you know, that would have looked, you know, that would have been much better for most people's verification. You know, that overall pattern, you just had that up, that map. But one thing that was interesting when you showed the 500 millibar, hemispheric view, the one thing that sort of stands out, and the models have on again, off again, done a rather poor job with this, which is a broad trough that's centered around and just east of Hawaii. You know, and this is a little bit what I mentioned last week. We've kind of had this, you know, we've flirted a lot with it, kind of a negative SOI, you know, for the middle and back half of winter, and that's a fairly good marker of that subtropical jet. You know, in last week's verification, you know, it manifests with a fairly wet and cold Texas to southeast. This one kind of sharpened up the trough and dug it in over like the Ohio Valley and Appalachians, you know, with a rather vigorous storm that went off the East Coast, I think around the 26th or 27th. So yeah, overall, it was like a super positive AO, and it's not a pattern you'd expect. But I think sometimes too, in like late winters, you sharpen up the wavelengths a bit, and these things can happen. And you know, this was a fairly big miss for kind of everyone in the forecast community, I should say. Looking, you know, at some of my notes of what I was thinking around like the 10th, 11th of February when this forecast was made, and you know, it really looked like kind of just the drumbeat of warmth. But you know, that's week 3.
Yeah, exactly. So, and we can pull up. Let's just do a couple other things here. What did I say? Feb 11th was the. All right, let's pull up the Yeah, we don't have all the data from Feb 11th, but we have some. So this is the Maxar forecast up in the top left. And yeah, I mean, to Dave's point here, you can see that, yeah, even forget the number for a second, just from a configuration, that's exactly where we had the trough, right down up, kind of the Ohio Valley in the southeast. So from a configuration, the Maxar forecast, kind of missed the mark there. Looking at the models here, we have the surface temperatures from the models, CFS. I want to say good-ish. And no reason I hesitate is the Texas. I don't think that Texas worked out that well, but I guess they had the cool in the eastern third, Ohio Valley into the southeast, and that worked out. Or maybe a little bit of Texas, I guess. But again, sometimes we say this often with the CFS: is it a broken clock or was it skillful? I don't know. EC obviously not really there in terms of the configuration. And then when we look at these numbers, we looked at the numbers on the board, but yeah, the EC wasn't too far off there. The CFS still too cold, but technically it was on the right side of normal, because directionally the CFX actually got a point from a directional hit, because directional hit rate is one of the skill metrics we look at, and they were on the correct side of the 30-year normal. The verification was just slightly colder. Let's take a quick read before we switch over to the forecast. Let's just see what they were talking about here. The patterns look to be influenced by the specific enhanced features, positive, EPO, WPO. We kind of talked about that a little bit. Yeah, see, this is where it gets real tricky. The AO, they talk about the positive AO, which that worked out, right? I mean, models in agreement with a persistent positive AO, strong stratospheric polar vortex, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, I mean, without beating a dead horse here, as Dave said here too, sometimes you get these shorter wavelength patterns that very difficult to predict at those long leads. I also want to bring up one other thing, and then I want to again open it up for see if Michael or anyone else has a question here. Let's just take a quick look at the bias too, errors and bias, but in particular, I was curious about the bias here. So with the EC and CFS, so we'll start with the 30-day, and then we'll look at the heating season. So here's the 30-day. Well, not good. The CFS bias for the past 5 forecasts, so once a week, plus, over plus 20 HDDs. EC not too much better, plus 16. All the human forecasts are better than that. Wow, so that's even including this past week. That's not good. And then the heating season. Let's look at the heating season in general. I'm going to sort by bias. These up here you can kind of ignore because these counts were very low. But looking at the CFS, really, pretty poor bias. So cold, plus almost 16 HDDs. That's a cold bias. Too cold, predicting too high HDDs for the CFS, and then the EC is about plus 7. So, I guess you could look at this and say as expected. Maybe I think historically Dave, correct me if I'm wrong here, but the CFS has tended to have a stronger, a known cold bias that even after years and years of new upgrades to the model, it's still very difficult to completely remove that bias.
That's correct. Yeah, that's very true.
Last point about this is, I thought about this in terms of my forecast process. How do I bake this in, right? Like obviously that there's been a bias, and how much should I apply that to the current forecast? So, all right, anyone else have any thoughts on the errors or biases or anything else in terms of attribution before we move on to the forecast?
I was just going over my notes from last week, or from the 11th when this was made. And that week I had tried out a new formula, and when basically every week I come up with like a weighting scheme of the metrics you see on the table, and the number that popped out was a cold number. And I was, slightly concerned because I looked at the table when everyone had made their forecast and everybody was warm. So I ended up bumping up my bias a bit to account for what appeared to be a warm period. So I remember having a hard time submitting that number, especially when I saw the table and saw how warm everyone else was going. But I guess maybe it kind of worked out in my favor a little bit. So I don't know. That was a tough period where I was trying not to let the biases of everybody else's forecasts, have an effect on mine.
That's a really great point. You might put it on mute. Sorry, Zach and I are sitting next to each other, so it's a little bit of echo. But I'm glad Zach brought that up. I'm really glad because for two reasons. But one, I remember exactly what Zach's talking about here. You can see his forecast, and a couple of us even did like a double take because again, it's emotions. You can't there's a psychology to this. There really is. As long as there's humans involved. And I remember, because there was so much data that from how this winter has evolved, thinking warm, and obviously you have people like very respected folks like Professor Decker and Poundy going so much warmer that there was like, hey, how do you get that number? So, and also it's worth mentioning here. It's certainly worth mentioning that Zach has been one of the top performers here. So this is not a fluke. When you look, I think when you sort this by consensus, when you sort this by the consensus, right, like kind of a mean of all the forecasts, Zach, here's his +4.2. It's on the right side here. And it's the highest of any human forecast here. The next closest is Philip. And then you have to go way down to Michael and me. So, and maybe also think about the current week. Zach and I were talking about this offline a little bit, and this will be a good segue, but how, Zach was right in terms of his forecast formula. It turned out to be, work well. And I was thinking about the current forecast here. Emotions played into my forecast here too. I was seeing lots of warm forecasts. I was seeing lots of warm themes, but then I was thinking to myself, could this be a case here again where we're missing something, where there could be an opportunity for cooler weather, cooler outcomes, despite what we're seeing here? So I don't know, Zach, I'm going to just put you on the spot one more time. Can you just, since it worked well and since it hasn't been a fluke, can you just elaborate for maybe just another minute or so in terms of your formula and why it might have been a little bit different than other folks?
I don't remember exactly at the time why I chose to go with the formula that I did. All I know is that what I had been doing for the 3 weeks before this period had all been, terrible. So I was just basically took those metrics, went to I think it was the heating season table overall, and picked some of the ones that had been doing well and tried to find a waiting season that balanced it. And then, as I always do, my own personal opinion kind of comes in on the sigma value. So I kind of assess what's going on and then adjust my sigma value based on how I feel my number would actually do. But I don't know, that's a tough question. I chose those values based on how they had been doing overall. So I don't know, maybe it was because I was coming at it with a fresh set of eyes rather than how I'd been doing it the couple weeks before. Maybe that allowed me to, not see those numbers, allowed me not to see the bias. I don't know.
Yeah, thank you. And you, of course, again, you can see his formula here at the bottom too. And, he's got some of the weighting on this MJO analog, which scored well in this forecast, and the 30-year moving average, right, happened to be very close. Whereas, folks like me, for example, said, you know what, I know more than the models and everything. And, I put in a -15 fudge factor, which, this is why we do it though, right? And this is why we take notes to test and see if some of these experiential views have merit and stuff like that. So, okay, that's helpful. All right, so we'll let's switch gears to the forecast. Now we can't avoid it. Now we have to talk about the current forecast, right? And so again, just to give a quick summary, March 3rd, we're forecasting out, God, it's hard to believe it, but March 18th to March 22nd. So HDDs are quickly fading. At least the normals are quickly fading. I'll sort this here just to give a quick overview. So the coldest forecast, the coldest forecast we have here is the one that scored the best from last week, which is the 30-year normal at 96.2. And interestingly, the warmest is the CFS. Go figure. Whenever I see something like that, I always feel like I have to go and do a spot check and make sure my data is wrong here, but I think it might be right. And a lot of forecasts in the middle. So, okay, who wants to kick us off? Michael, how about you? You want me
Yeah,
to
I
put
was
you on
I
the
was
spot?
about to I was about to say I can do it. All right. So my forecast was 83.4 HDDs with a spread of 16.1. The 83.4 is pretty significantly warmer than the 30-year normal. Spread's the same. So the main difference in my forecast this week from last week is I increased the CPC by 10% and decreased the teleconnections by 10%. So my reason for this was the teleconnections weren't giving me a super clear signal. They were all hovering around neutral to slightly positive. I ended up treating them as a warm signal since the trend this year has been to verify positive whenever it's calling for anything to get close to neutral or negative. It usually verifies a little bit more positive um, than what they're forecasting at this head time. So you can see there the AO looks like it wants to head towards maybe even negative for the first time since last year. But I'm skeptical of that since usually, like I said, it verifies on the positive side, especially at these longer range forecasts. The CPC is incredibly warm over, if I remember correctly, yeah, over what is essentially the majority of demand areas. 70% above average chance in Chicago, 60% over essentially everywhere else. um, so very, very warm signal from the CPC. And that's where I essentially came up with my number of being so above average in terms of heat, so below average HDDs. Any questions?
Yeah, I have a question. I'll put my industry jerky hat on. So Michael, you're telling me it's going to be warm, but we said that about last week, last week's verification, and it actually verified close to the 30-year normal. Why do you think this period's going to be different? I mean, why are you so confident that we're going to actually verify warm this time?
Well, last week was I think just an unfortunate situation, as was mentioned by David, that it's kind of difficult to hit a 5-day window. Something a storm happened to bring a lot of rain to the southeast, which made, of course, the temperatures to go down. So they had a cooler than average HDDs during this period. In late March, I don't, as I think was also mentioned, and I agree that I don't think that, excuse me, that in late March there can be as great of an effect if something similar happened, that there be a similar effect since the South is starting to wind down its HDD production at this time frame. So basically, my answer to your question is, even if a similar situation happened to last week, I don't think that it would be able to get as close to the 30-year normal as it did, just because it's so much later into March rather than early March.
Okay, and again, it sounds like you're using the synoptic argument, an isle of cool and a sea of warmth kind of thing. right? This is just sort of an isolated period of cool, and you feel pretty confident that that's not indicative of a pattern shift.
Yeah.
Let me ask you one other jerky industry question. You mentioned the AO, and Dave Darkangelo, feel free to play jerky industry person too. This is what we try to do with our younger student forecasters. It's one of the benefits of participating, by the way. You mentioned the AO, which I think is a great point about the AO this winter. Let me pull it up. I guess what's my question? Do you have any thoughts? You've been forecasting all winter as to what's driving this positive, this bias, in particular in the longer range forecasts, like the, out toward day 15. Why, since whatever December, has it in general verified much more positive than forecast?
So I don't have a concrete answer for you, so I'd have to do a lot of research into as to why that might be, but I can venture a guess that it might be, and this is off some experience, nothing, not like I don't have any data to back this up, but last year when the polar vortex collapsed in, it was late December, early January, I don't remember when exactly, but the models went all over the place with a super negative AO. And this year it's been kind of the opposite with an abnormally strong polar vortex. So my hypothesis is that the models are not handling the extremes in the polar vortex all that well and not resolving it um, particularly well in range, and even in shorter range forecasts, the 7-day doesn't look particularly great either. The spread is smaller, but it's even that small spread hasn't helped a lot. But that's my guess for you would be that it's because the polar vortex is so abnormally strong, the models are having a hard time resolving that in the AO forecast.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions for Michael? Good.
I will go next. So it's kind of funny that you're just talking about the last week's verification and my forecast strategy from the 11th, because I kind of ran into a similar issue today when I was making today's forecast. So the value I ended up forecasting was 91.2 HCDs. My sigma is slightly above the normal sigma for the 30-year. Basically, I kept the same weighting scheme that I used last week. I kind of went back to the one I had started with at the beginning of the winter just because of how volatile the last couple of weeks have been. And it seems that there's either a major pattern shift or just plain old volatility, a little bit of cool in the sea of warmth that Dave was mentioning before. Either way, when I was looking at the models, I saw a lot of warmth in our period, but also, interestingly enough, a lot of warmth in the models leading up to that period as well. I think the CFS had a little bit of cold in the west, but for the most part, both the EC and the CFS were showing warmth leading up to the entire period, to our period of interest. Problem was when I did my calculations and my 91.2 popped out, it was it's warmer than 30-year, but on the colder side compared to all the other metrics on our table. So it led me to think again, should I, take a less mechanical, robotic approach to my forecast and, try and let some, opinion and bias of my own kind of seep in, because what I keep doing is that I keep making my forecast, just doing a straight weighting scheme with the metrics on the table and then adjusting my sigma accordingly. But when that number pops out and I have a hard time thinking that could be the actual value, then I have to move the sigma around. So anyway, I bumped it up this week because it seems that everything is consistent with warmth, but based on how volatile the winter has been, I could also see it shifting a little bit towards the colder side too. I don't really know this is a pretty uncertain forecast for me. But either way, my value came in a little bit warmer than the 30-year normal, and I bumped up my sigma because I'm uncertain about this forecast.
So Zach, what was the number you ended up putting in, the 91.2? Was that your statistical number, or did you hedge your statistical number? I kind of missed that, I think.
No, that was my pure statistical number.
Okay, so you're going with it this week.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean,
Cool.
part of me is thinking because I went with it from the 11th, that I should just keep doing what I'm doing. But you know, everyone else when they're making their forecast kind of hedges the numbers on both the sigma side and the mean side, and I'm only doing it on the sigma side. So part of me thinks maybe I should try doing it when I'm forecasting the mean as well. But as David pointed out, I'm doing pretty well. I don't really know if it's luck or not. I can't quite put my finger on what I'm doing that's working. But I'm definitely, because I'm new at this, I'm definitely uncertain and don't have a set method.
No, own it. You're doing great.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
I was just looking at your formula there, Zach. I notice, can you comment? I notice, you don't have any weighting on the models, the numerical model guidance, the EC and CFS. Again, like you said, I guess it's worked, and the EC and CFS haven't been great. But what would it take? Is there, for you to kind of start to weight those models again? I mean, do you envision ever, or do you look at them, and how do you determine, is there any scenario where you could see yourself putting some weight on them, or are you at this point completely, I'm just discounting them because there's just no clear situation where I think they're going to provide value to my forecast?
Yeah, I basically, when I started this in the summer, I was weighting in the CFS and the EC, but pretty much since September or so, I've completely taken them out, and I have not once put them back in. I don't foresee myself doing that just because they've been so inconsistent, and especially even if this week would not be a period that I would do that, just because I don't know, that I always get a little bit hesitant when every input is forecasting on the same side of the 30-year normal. That makes me nervous. So especially when, anytime the CFS is warmer than the EC, I get concerned. So this week would not been a week that I would have even contemplated it.
That's an interesting point too about the CFS, because we don't see that too often. But just putting on the back burner for a second, I just thought, we can look at the directional skills since the start of the contest, going back over a year. And it's this column. Well, there's a few columns for directional, but there's a subset that just look at heating season and cooling, which are interesting. But the one that looks at all of them is this directional, correct here. And you can see the EC is at 54%-ish. The CFS makes me chuckle a little bit. It's at 41%. In other words, it's almost like skillfully bad. You kind of go in the opposite direction, and you're almost 60% of the time you'd be right. That's basically, again, this is compared to normal. But yeah, I mean, and just since we are in the heating season, and I think it's important to consider that, because when you look at directional skill just for the heating season, the EC score goes down below 50. So it's less than a flip of a coin, 40, almost 47%. And we won't even talk about the CFS. I'll just let you look at that number. What you see is, so a couple of things, and then the other thing Zach said about the summer, I think is a really good point. The models, at least as compared to the 30-year, and I don't think this will surprise Dave D'Arcangelo, but they do a better job, at least as compared to the 30-year, in getting the directional skill right. Obviously, forecasting warm, and it verifies warm. So you can see there's the EC, and what we have. How many summers? One summer, I think, of score. Right. This will be the second summer. Yeah. So I guess last summer, the EC was 1% correct. Directionally in the summer. So bottom line is, I think Zach, with my jerkish industry hat on, there's an argument to be made here that, look, we have 2 winters of metrics from the EC and CFS, and directionally speaking, in the heating season, both models are below 50, below a flip of the coin. So I think it's difficult to figure out exactly. When we're talking about the 16 to 20, we're not talking about day 5. Obviously, that's a much different beast. But for day 16 to 20, I think it really is a challenging question. This is something that we talk about a lot. Like, how do you incorporate those models in a way that's going to improve your skill? Like, objectively, subjectively, like how? I mean, because in one respect, I feel very uncomfortable saying to like a trader, screw the EC, screw the CFS, because on the other hand, facts matter, right? There's some information here. It's not conclusive. One skill metrics does not make everything, but it's a pretty important skill metric that we have here that says it's a flip of a coin or maybe worse. So anyway, just bring that up if anyone has any comments on that.
I just think it's something that we can write down and keep in the back of our minds, that for whatever reason, every time I open up the page when I'm making my forecast and I see that the CFS is warmer than the EC, that I just mentally flag that as this could potentially be an interesting period. I think it would be really cool to look down the line and pick all those periods where the CFS was forecasting the EC and see what actually came about of those. And it was the CFS actually right? That kind of thing. I think that would be a cool project to look at down the line.
I think that'd be really cool too. And I feel like we had this conversation just like a week or two. Didn't it happen? I'll see if I can pull this up real quick, and then we'll move on. But I'm just going to pull up was it the 4th? CFS was warmer and actually was right. It definitely wasn't. No, it was slightly. No, yeah, it was. Sorry. This forecast period, it was slightly warmer, right? And the forecast was right around there. But yeah, anyway, I think that's a great point, right? Because, right, typically, and it, as shown by the bias, which we looked at earlier, right? In the heating season, the CFS has had a more severe bias. So typically it's colder. It would be interesting. Is it just dumb luck that sometimes the CFS is warmer than the EC? Or in those situations, is it maybe that the CFS is better able to identify maybe signals in warm patterns, and that you should put more weight on the CFS, and that's assuming that you should put weight on any of the numerical guidance to begin with. All right, Dave D'Arcangelo, would you like to share with us your thoughts on the forecast?
I'm actually weighting the Euro weekly and the CFS a bit higher today than I might ordinarily, and I'm kind of in between those two. I think I just kind of thumbnailed an 81 in there. The interesting thing today is that the models in the late 11 to 15 day, if you evaluate them from like a cluster analysis perspective, which is looking for similarities amongst all the ensemble members, the last few days, and including today's runs, are fairly high in terms of clustering towards the warm side of the distribution, on the order of 80%-ish that are kind of warm leaning in that day 14, 15 window. And it matches fairly well the week 3 look that the Euro's given. So I think to us, when the cluster analysis is reasonably high, and we think it fits with the seasonality of it, then I'll say we're locking in on a warm forecast. But we've got some confidence in a warm forecast. I look back actually at the period we just verified, which most everyone except Zach did pretty poorly. And one thing that I think may have been being discounted that day that prediction was made, I looked at the clusters that were prepared on February 11th for what would have been day 15, which is kind of the beginning of the target window. And those clusters were actually interestingly cool, or cool to cold leaning, at least on the order of like being a 50-50-ish kind of view, which is I looked back, 60% of the GFS ensembles members were cold in kind of the south central southeast, and 40% of the Euro clusters were leaning to the colder side, which is a far bit, both of them, far bit colder than where we've seen recent clusters. And I'm not trying to say this is the end all be all of kind of like 16 to 20 days, but to see that kind of a coin flip at the end of 11 to 15 day, at the time maybe it should have given someone, some forecasters pause, because everyone, you're bringing up that Maxar you put up, Dave. Everyone was predicting a very mild window, and clearly it didn't occur. But the models were seeing at least something, or at least seeing the risk that there'd be kind of this short wavelength, choppy, seeing some troughiness at times, and the amplitude of that ended up being much stronger, which I think maybe was a little bit surprising when you looked at the verification. Today, though, on the other hand, the clusters are in fairly strong agreement. Like I said, 80%-ish or better, and that kind of dovetails to the weeklies pretty well.
Hey, Dave, two questions, I guess. One, can you talk a little bit more about clustering? Because I'm not sure the folks here have heard that term
Sure.
much in the models, and how you use it.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So, yep. So the way clustering is, what clustering is first is we have 50 Euro ensemble members and then 20 GFS ensemble members. Amongst those, Dave brought that up. This is kind of the spaghetti. So when you break these down, even visually, sometimes you can see kind of next nearest pairs. So it's an analysis which looks at the proximity of ensemble members to one another over a particular domain. And so you don't isolate it down to like the state level or even the national level. These tend to look at across, like, say, the North American space, but like that Dave up here has here is fairly evident. And so, Dave, I think one thing maybe try to help me point out, like, look at, there's decent agreement actually over Texas, but if you look at the Southeast, you get the sense that there's not a lot of ensemble members that are attached with the mean of the distribution. There's actually a good number that show a ridge up into the Carolinas and Mid-Atlantic, and therefore the probability intervals may show like exactly what Dave's pointing to there. That might show there's a significant amount of ensemble members that are there, and that kind of parses out as a cluster. But then on the flip side of that, over like Central and South Florida, there's a sense that you can see in these spaghettis of a decent trough. So there's quite a bit of spread over the Southeast. And so the mean of the ensemble is a really poor representation of the possible outcomes of the forecast. And so we can break these ensembles into probability intervals, and from there kind of evaluate maybe some risk to the forecast. And so, there's this kind of sense still of a Southeast trough, or at least a decent number of ensemble members that have the Southeast trough. But on the flip side of that, if you look over like the Great Lakes and Northeast, a great majority of the members are showing a ridge somewhere from the Great Lakes to Eastern Canada, with very few showing kind of troughiness, kind of carving through the Ohio Valley or Mid-Atlantic in those light blues. So.
Any questions for Dave about the clustering? Yeah, I think, I'm certainly, I don't have a ton of experience looking at clustering, but one of the, I guess with my research hat on, one of the things that I think would be interesting to study more with clustering is, we know that with weather, there's a lot of sort of nonlinear impacts and stuff. And so trying to understand those impacts, and as meteorologists, especially in the commodities industry, you have to think about those kinds of things. Like, it may not just be as simple as, well, if it does this in Atlanta's, 40, and if it does this, Atlanta's 50 or whatever. It could be that, hey, if we get the trough in the Gulf, then it could spin up a low, right? And especially in March or February, and it could spin up a low off the East Coast. And if that happens, you get nor'easter, you get that maybe it has a synoptic impact on the NAO, right? It triggers a change in the NAO, and et cetera, et cetera. So if you can better understand how those different clusters and configurations might have downstream impacts beyond just, it's 5 degrees warmer or colder in Atlanta, then then you might be able to better provide a better risk assessment and opportunity for your end users.
Hey, David, I'm going to add one more thing too, with regards to clustering. Clustering is just one more attempt to try to get at what I think is the holy grail behind predictions. And this is predictions across any space, whether it's the 6 to 10 day or the 16 to 20, or even kind of the monthly or whatever period you want to pick. But the holy grail is that you're looking for a distribution of outcomes or a representative distribution of outcomes. That is the most challenging things that remains in this kind of space in the industry. We do deterministic forecasts, and I think that for the purposes of doing the contest, it's really instructional to make the deterministic forecast. But end users and clients probably work best in an environment where you can provide a distribution of outcomes, and not just like a thumbnail distribution, but some sense of a kind of a realistic, back-tested distribution of outcomes. And when you can try to do that, subtle changes in that can still carry a lot of meaning. So you might predict, say, a warm forecast, but it's for some end users, it's a big difference of whether you're, say, 80% aligned with a warm forecast or 60% aligned with the warm forecast, because smart end users still would recognize that, even though the forecast is warm biased at 60%, there's still 40%, which is clearly not an insignificant outcome of possibilities that are to the colder side. And then you can define that, whether that's the normal or whether it's below average or whatever. So that's really, I think, what we're making an attempt with cluster analysis, is to provide some broader view of potential scenarios.
Yeah, that's great. Any other questions for Dave? I have one more question for Dave, but does anyone else have any questions for Dave? Dave, as much as you're willing to talk about your forecast process and this and that, how do you, we were just talking about the skill of the EC and CFS, and obviously that's just one small subset of performance. It's not comprehensive. And, for example, we're not even looking at the EC twice a week. We're just looking at the EC once a week, right? So it's not, there's other data points. There's other ways to evaluate the performance. How do you, when it comes to week ahead, I guess medium range, and you can even talk about long range, right? I know you have experience with month ahead. Thinking about this winter and stuff, how much do you utilize the model data, the numerical model data, the EC and the CFS specifically? How much weight do you put on it? And B, how much weight do you think the market puts on those? In other words, even if you think the CFS is shit, so to speak, if and you're just 100% confident that it has no skill, if it comes out one day in January with a super cold forecast, what kind of impacts would it have on the market?
Huge. It's significant. So the market is really finely tuned, for better or for worse, towards model changes. The main reason for that is that it's the most easily accessible piece of information that comes out daily, or obviously multiple times daily. And there's all kinds of numbers you can crunch off of that. You can turn your HDD forecast into, you can look at it by region. You can get a sense of natural gas or electricity demand. You can start to pull out things like wind forecasts or solar forecasts now, which are increasingly important. So the market is very, very attuned to those model changes. So much so that there was quite a reckoning at the beginning of winter with regards to violent reactions in the market to forecasts that at times were showing significant cold in the back, which ultimately never verified. And of course, the market still takes a little while to learn its lesson, and we forecasters, obviously, we take a long time to learn that as well. So we had to get beaten up by that. So there's always that idea behind, there's always that data staring you in the face with regards to model forecasts that come out daily. If that fits with your preconceived notion of how things should be looking, that's great, but there certainly can be a lot of false confidence that gets applied. You know, we could have a longer discussion, Dave, I think, about kind of how generational forecasters look at model output, depending on when they were trained and how they were brought up with regards to examining model data and how much to scrutinize it. But to answer your probably your bigger question, which is the market is, you know, it's a 9.5 out of 10 in terms of how much it pays attention.
Great, thank you. And we'll definitely be able to follow up with, there is more, but maybe we'll save it for future discussions when we have, when Dave comes back and stuff. I do want to leave a couple minutes for Michael, if you're ready. Michael's been working on a research project investigating, looking at the bias in the ECMWF, the medium range ECMWF, and you know, just kind of investigating different types of bias correction methods and kind of evaluating it, ultimately with the goal of, you know, of answering the question of, you know, does a bias correction, at least for the medium range guidance, provide value add information, and you know, just trying to plug something like that into our forecast process, and then not just in a subjective way, but maybe even eventually as an objective method, similar to how we have the MJO input. So anyway, with that, Michael, would you like the screen, or do you just want to talk as?
I can do either. If you think it'll be better if I share the screen, I can.
Sure. It's up to you. We have a couple minutes here, so I'm going to stop my share. Let's see. You can share, hopefully.
Yeah, I gotta find the button.
That's not it. All right, I stopped. It should be on the bottom.
Yeah, I see it. Okay, let's share that. Okay, so you guys should see. You guys see it?
Good. Yep.
Okay. So the purpose of my research project is to try to find a reliable bias correction method for the euro that improves forecasting accuracy in terms of CDDs and HDDs, and this is mainly for the 16 to 20 day period modeled after the forecast contest. So a quick summary of what I did and then some of the results so far. So I created 8 bias correction methods using some of the various data I had available to me, most of which comes from the forecast contest, and created bias correction methods and compared them to the normal euro score for that week using skill metric called MAPE, mean absolute percent error. And so far, the only season that I've been running this since early May, I think May 7th was the first CDD season forecast where I started running this. And I've been running it, you know, through now March 3rd. So the only season I have so far of completed data is the CDD season where input 4 was able to outperform the euro listed here as input 1, this blue one. You can see that this is the MAPE score over the average MAPE score over the CDD season, so May to October, I think it was. So you can see input 4 was able to beat the euro by around 3.5 percentage points on average. And to continue that, so far this HDD season, input 4 has actually mirrored this score from the CDD season and is currently beating the euro by, I believe, 5 percentage points on average using the same skill metrics. Gonna have to continue to watch to see if that holds through the rest of the HDD season. And just to finish up with some things I'm working on, I'm gonna have a page with graphs that'll show this, not just this one. And I'm also working on another method to try and more consistently beat the euro, because that's been a problem with all of my bias correction methods, is that they can beat the euro on a given week, but they won't beat it every single week, even if they score better overall. So that's something I'm trying to work on to see if I can find something that can beat it, not just overall, but consistently, because I feel like that would have a little bit more value, especially for industry, if there's something I can give them that can beat it consistently. And I'm working on a few other things that I could go into greater detail if you want. I can also go into greater detail on any of this stuff. Or if you don't have time now, I could send it to you. I've got here, yeah, methodology that goes into what these things are and how I made them essentially. And that's my slightly longer. I think I went over, as I often do, as Dave will probably berate me for later. Elevator pitch.
Quickly, Michael, what is input number 4?
Input number 4 is a 10-year blend bias correction. So I took the 10-year normal forecast for the particular period. So like I take 91.5 for this particular week, and takes, I believe it's 60% of, no, 75% of this forecast, and blend it with 25% of the euro forecast for that particular week. And the number that comes out is the forecast. That's what's been doing particularly well since I started.
Do you have numbers on like how consistently input number 4 does better than the EC? Do you know?
Exactly numbers, no, I don't, but just looking, I do keep track of how often it's, you can see between the green, it means it did better than the normal euro, the red means it did worse. So in the CDD season, just eyeballing it, it was kind of 50-50 split. During this current HDD season, you can see it's done a lot better. It's, to me, that looks more like a 60-40-ish split. So as for an exact number, I don't have that yet. That's one of those graphs I'm currently working on.
I was going to say it might be helpful if you think if it's if it's at a point now or in the near future, if you can send out just a quick summary, just give folks, even like Dave D'Arcangelo, a chance to kind of digest it offline, and just kind of look over the results. I think just a quick thing on the results, whatever the results you have, and the methods, so that like I could sit, like for me, like I could sit down on the couch, whatever, and I'm looking, okay, here are the 5 methods, whatever it is. And then I could look at the results and kind of just think about it. I think that would be kind of interesting. In particular, I think folks want to compare the raw. Like, okay, if I was just using raw EC, all right, here's what the score would have been, and then and then the different variants of the bias correction. And you definitely don't have to worry. We've talked about this, but about it being right every time. If it were right every time, then the first thing someone would say to you is the model's overfit, right? It's impossible, right? So, but I think it would be really interesting if you could kind of just summarize it, take all this and just a really, like a half page or a page as short as possible, and just give folks a chance to digest it. And then maybe we could talk about it again next week or the week after.
Yeah, I think I kind of did that because I remember you mentioned to build an executive summary. So I think that's what this might be. What you're looking for. I'm not sure if this is exactly what you meant, but
It could be. So say maybe if you could put that in bulleted form, just because it makes it's a little nicer. But if you could put that
yeah,
something like that in bulleted form, like here are the highlights. Maybe in that paragraph there's 5 highlights or whatever it is, or 6. Yeah, I think that'd be great. And then we'll have again, I think that'd be something that we can everyone can digest offline a little bit, and then we can have I think it would help folks ask better questions, right? Because then everyone will have 2 minutes to kind of look over what you want them to look over, and then say, hey, can you talk a little bit more about this particular method?
yeah, I know what you're saying.
Yeah, Dave, I'd be happy to take a look at that, and it really sounds super promising. Also, Michael, it looks like you've done some really good work. So I'd like to offer my 2 cents if you wouldn't mind. And Dave, you have my email. You can pass it along to him, and we'll take a look at that.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I'll definitely send it today.
All right, great. Well, I think we're just about out of time, so that's perfect closure. Any parting thoughts before we end the meeting? All right. Well, thanks, Dave. Thank you for joining us. This is really helpful. A lot of good discussion. Michael, thank you also for sharing your research, and I'll get you Dave's email. And yeah, look forward hopefully to doing this again next week. Thank you, everyone.
Yep. Thanks.